Rem, welcome. I'm so glad to see you this morning. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Yep, it's good to see you. Hey, let's start with our first question, and it's a broad one to kind of get an overview. Tell us how you became aware of Hartman's work and why you've been committed to it throughout your career.
Okay. Uh, I became acquainted with Hartman and his work as something of an accident of history or a gift of the grace of God, whichever way you want to see it. But I joined the faculty in philosophy at the University of Tennessee in 1966. And two important things happened in the philosophy department that year. One is John Davis, who was one of Hartman's former students, became the head of the philosophy department that year. And the other is uh, a new PhD program in philosophy was beginning to be offered by the University of Tennessee in that year. And I and one other colleague, Dwight Van de Veen, were brought to the University of Tennessee in order to help initiate and staff this new PhD program in philosophy. Uh, 2 years later, not 1 year later, as I said in an earlier discussion, but 2 years later in 1968, Hartman joined the faculty also in philosophy at the University of Tennessee as the university's first distinguished research professor. So I got acquainted with Hartman and his work simply because I happened to be here at the time that he came.
So did you have any idea that this would become a big piece of your life's work?
I had no idea that it would, but it did.
Yes, it did.
And I'm very happy that it did.
Yes,
And
yes.
you also asked about what was the other part of your question?
It was, how you became aware of it and why you became committed to it. Now
Oh
you have
yeah,
other
I became
interests.
committed to it. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, there are two basic approaches to Hartman. One is you get into Hartman because you're a consultant using the very powerful personality value-based Hartman value profile. And the other way to get into it is through understanding the theory behind the profile. And my focus through the years has been almost entirely on the theory behind the profile. So I think I'm committed to Hartman because I think that his general theory of value is probably the most plausible, most defensible, most insightful, and most helpful, most applicable theory of value that I know of anywhere. Now, this doesn't mean that I agree with Hartman about everything. I've had some very fundamental disagreements with Hartman. I'm not a true believer who agrees with Hartman about everything. But I think that if you make a few modifications in Hartman's value theory, which I have expressed in print a number of times, you will end up with a truly wonderful general theory of value.
That's awesome. So how would you explain the theory of value to someone who is coming to this podcast? Maybe they're a client of mine or they've listened to other podcasts. How would you explain what this is to, or you're having dinner with a friend and they
Yeah.
talk to you about what you're doing? How do you generally explain this? And then how do you explain why it matters?
Okay, well, philosophers since the time of Plato has searched for the form of the good, which played an important part in Plato's philosophy. But no one before Hartman had ever figured out what it was or how to define it. And Hartman did figure out what it was and how to define it. Some philosophers have said it couldn't be defined at all, but he showed that it could be defined in a very formal way as standard or concept fulfillment. And that means that before you can judge anything to be good, you got to have some notion of what it is and also what its good making features or properties are. And then you have to compare reality that you're wondering about with the standard. And if it meets the standard, it's a good thing. And it's just purely a matter of following the logic of Hartman's understanding of goodness. And of course, that can be used by almost anyone in any area of human interest. It isn't just moral goodness that is concerned here, but every kind of goodness imaginable is covered by that form of the good. And Hartman distinguished three different basic kinds of value as well: systemic, extrinsic, and intrinsic. Other philosophers had distinguished 2 out of 3 of those, but and the systemic had always been there, but Hartman was the first to identify this as a separate and distinct realm of value. Systemic values are just conceptual, mental, philosophical, theoretical values. Extrinsic values are useful, practical activities and things and processes in the world. And intrinsic values, well, there's a lot of debate philosophically about what that is, but Hartman's solution is one that he finally convinced me that he was right about, and that is it's unique individual centers of consciousness like human persons. And you can do an awful lot with that once you've got that basic framework. And then there's one other basic element in the framework, and that's the hierarchy of values. What the hierarchy of value tells us basically in application is that people are more valuable than mere things, mere inanimate objects and processes, like cars, for example, or land, and both of those are more valuable than mere ideas about them. So, the conceptual dimension of human interest and value is overall the least valuable. The practical, applicable, do it, work, make it work aspect of it is even more valuable than ideas about making it work. And the most important thing of all, the supreme value is intrinsic values, that is individual persons or animals or God. You can extend this in many different directions.
Wonderful description. How has knowing these dimensions and, knowing all three as a philosopher who's into, quote unquote, into ideas, how has that impacted you personally? Knowing those dimensions, and can you tie anything to today from knowing that, how it might have changed you?
Well, it has changed me. One of the most remarkable things about this theory, once you really get into it and internalize it and begin to use it, is that it transforms your whole personality. It gives you a new, refreshing, enlightening way to think about things. It also has an influence on how you work and what you do, how you behave, and every practical aspect of of human living, including your own personal living. And it also gives you a supreme ideal to work with and to work toward, and that is the ideal of intrinsically valuing everybody and everything, and that means loving everyone and everything, and having compassion toward everyone and everything, and identifying yourself intensely and personally with anything and everything. Now that's hard to do, and learning how to do it is not an overnight achievement. It's something that you work toward all for all the rest of your life, and I'm still working toward it. I'm not there yet.
Well, you have been described as very intrinsic. And I have some quotes here that we'll go through in a little while, but one of the descriptions, which is so interesting, here you are a professor of philosophy for 32 years, you've written 22 books, on thought, and then people talk about how all the intrinsic things that you have done for them. they adore the knowledge they've learned from you, but the theme is he cared, he listened, he valued me. I mean, they didn't all use those words necessarily, but their comments about you represented that.
Well, I appreciate all those good thoughts about me. I just hope that they're true.
Yeah, no arms were twisted to get those quotes. Freely given. There was no making anybody do anything. Tell me a little bit about how you came from a small town in Georgia, which I thought that was new. I didn't know that you came from a small town in Georgia to being a professor for all these years, writing all these books, being an editor, and being, really admired by so many people in the philosophical world. How did that happen? Did you come from a philosophical learning type family?
I did not come from a philosophical background or a philosophical family. I'm going to have to start with my indebtedness to my mother and grandmother. My father died when I was 6 months old.
Oh,
So
wow.
I never knew him. My mother, fortunately, had a job as a postal clerk, and she brought my grandmother over to live with us and take care of me while I was growing up. And she supported us, and the two of them really encouraged me and supported me and helped me and in every way imaginable. And I'm sure that a large part of the personality that I have today is indebted to my mother and my grandmother. But I'm going to skip way on ahead now beyond high school, and there's a lot of good things I can say about that. But I started college at Emory Junior College at Oxford, Georgia. We called it Emory at Oxford. This is where Emory University was first started. And college was a tremendously exciting and enlightening period of time for me, especially those first 2 years there. I had some wonderful teachers and wonderful fellow students, and I tell people that during my first 2 years at Emory at Oxford, I got 2 years of high school and 2 years of college, all in 2 years' time.
Wow.
So from there, I went on to Emory University. Now, this is where philosophy comes in. I never even knew what philosophy was until I became a junior in college. Most people who graduate from the junior college, Emory at Oxford, went on to what we call Big Emory in Atlanta.
Yeah.
So when I got to be a junior in college, I went on to Big Emory in Atlanta. And I didn't know what I wanted to major in, so I signed up for a variety of courses. One of those courses just happened to be a course in the history of philosophy, specifically of Greek philosophy, ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, being taught by Richard Hawking. And it was also an amazing revelatory experience for me. John Davis said that when he was first exposed to philosophy, that was a truly revelatory experience for him. Now, I didn't think of it in exactly those terms at the time. I'd been in that course for a couple of weeks, and I was telling myself, gee, this is really good stuff. This is really interesting. By the time I'd been in there a month, I was telling myself, wow, this is what I've been looking for all along, and I didn't even know it. So I continued with that course and ended up as a philosophy major. And by the time I graduated from college, I decided I wanted to be a college teacher. And the one thing that made that possible was that late in my senior year, I was one of 2 students at Emory who were nominated to receive a Danforth Graduate Fellowship. Now, at that time, the Danforth family, who owned a significant portion of Ralston Purina, saw a need that they, as a very generous family, decided to try to fill. That was a need for a whole batch of college professors in all different fields who would be on hand to teach the baby boomers who had been born right after World War II. And the Danforth family poured millions of dollars into educating hundreds of new PhDs in all different academic disciplines so that they would be available to teach the baby boomers. And I just happened to fall into that category. And I did receive the Danforth Foundation, and it paid for my entire graduate career. I went on from Emory to Yale University, Yale Divinity School. I really didn't know when I graduated from Emory what I wanted to teach. I knew I wanted to teach. I committed myself to the Danforth Foundation to be or become a teacher once I got my PhD degree. But I didn't know whether I wanted to teach religion or philosophy. So went to Yale Divinity School. I took as many courses in the Department of Philosophy at Yale during that period of time. For 3 years, I struggled with trying to decide whether I wanted to teach philosophy or religion. And after 3 years, philosophy won. So I got a PhD in philosophy, and I've been teaching philosophy ever since. I've lost track of what your original question was. You want to
No, it's perfect. It's
tell me
perfect.
where you want to go from there?
No, it's perfect because it tells the story of how you went from being in a small town in Georgia to how you got to where you were, where you
Well,
are.
the small town in Georgia where I grew up was not at all philosophical.
No, that's what I was wondering. My first peek into philosophy was I had taken a sociology course, probably my freshman or sophomore year, and I disliked it tremendously. I thought, okay, they're not doing anything with this. It's just, I don't know. I felt impatient with it. So then the next time I took another elective, I guess it was an elective because I was a journalism major, but I took a philosophy course, and then the professor was Dr. Von Frank. And I remember sitting there saying, okay, I don't understand everything that he's saying, but I sure do like this. I sure do want to understand this. I want to be around this. I want to be around ideas. And I'm surely did not verbalize all that, but I remember. And then I met some other philosophy students, and I still remember, you remember the moment, I remember what Dr. Von Frank looked like. I don't remember any of my other professors. I remember that student that I met who went on to become a PhD in philosophy. And while I'm not scholarly, I am supremely interested in ideas and being around people who are scholarly. And so, I am in the field of that. I'm on the consultant side of the equation that you mentioned at the start. But so talking about that, I'm curious about, as a professor, for 32 years and plus, because you kept an office way after you retired there at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. What are some of the, I would think sometimes being a philosophy professor could be very gratifying because it's your field, but also challenging to get points across to these young minds who are thinking about a lot of other things.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what you would say were the best and hardest parts of being a philosophy professor.
The best parts were interacting with philosophy faculty and students and trying to teach philosophy to students. That certainly takes you beyond the purely systemic aspects of anything, because
Yep.
you're interacting with very real people and trying, whether you know it or not, to influence their lives and their values and their way of thinking about everything. Not everyone who is a teacher in a college admits that that's what they're doing, but that is exactly what they're doing anyway. And so just interacting with students, but also I think that curiosity has been the driving force behind my intellectual career, or the intellectual aspect of my career. And over the years, I've had an opportunity to do research and writing and publication and editing on things that I had an immense personal curiosity about. So you know, the people and the intellectual fulfillment, I
Yeah.
think, have been the two most important aspects and fulfilling aspects of my career as a philosopher. I
Yeah.
want to say that I had some wonderful teachers all along the way at both Emory University and Yale Divinity School and the Yale Department of Philosophy. And I have to give them an awful lot of credit for giving me the background that I have needed for the professional career that I have had.
Where do you think your work is? You have many specialties in your work, and you know everything from I made little notes here: philosophy of religion, medical ethics, ethical theory, mental health care ethics, ethics in animals, formal axiology, American philosophy. Where do you think? And this may be a broad question, but I'll go to the formal axiology part. Where do
Yeah.
you think all of that is headed based on the past and the books that you've written and what's happening with the Hartman Institute now and the broader picture, because you have a bigger picture than I do on that. Where do you think axiology is going, if anywhere?
Well, I've been a terrible predictor of the future all of my life. And I'm not sure where it's going, to be perfectly honest. I have some hopes about where it will go.
Okay, tell us those, what your hopes are.
Well, I'm hoping that more and more people will get involved in axiology, both as consultants and on the college and academic level. I've made several important contributions, I think, to the Hartman Institute. This may be getting into another topic, but I've been a board member and a secretary and treasurer for many decades in the Hartman Institute. I've done what I could do to sustain and promote the Hartman Institute itself. The Hartman Institute has the basic responsibility and objective of promoting Hartman's work and ideas and what you can do with them practically. So I've done a lot of work for the Institute. And one of my objectives during all of those years was to try to see to it that as much of Hartman's own works and as many articles and books about Hartman got published and available to anyone who wants to read them. And then in 2008, I founded, created, and became the senior editor of the Institute's Journal of Formal Axiology. And I continued as the senior editor in that for 10 years. Cliff Hurst, wonderful successor, doing a terrific job, is now the senior editor of that journal. But I hope that in all of these ways and with the cooperation of all the people who are now working so hard in the Institute, I hope that Hartmanian axiology has a very bright future. It is a hope. I cannot predict that anything will ever happen. I'm not a good predictor of the future.
Yeah. I'm usually like a couple of weeks ahead of and that's it. So I
A
would
couple of weeks behind.
and so if it grows, more and more people would understand these dimensions, you know, at the street level. The philosophers would add to the material. I think I have heard and understand that Hartman said, I'm just starting this.
That is true. He expected his philosophy to develop significantly beyond the point where he left it. And he predicted that. And
yeah.
He said that, you know, in another 20 or 30 years, what I'm doing with philosophy today will hardly be recognizable. It will be transformed significantly. And I hope that I've helped to transform it just a little bit and to develop it further than Hartman himself did. As I say, I disagree with Hartman on a few things, but I believe that you can fix all of that and come out with a great value theory that has the potential and only the potential for changing the world.
Mhm.
But, I don't know whether that'll ever happen.
So changing the world, do you believe that if people understood the dimensions and ordered their life in that way, that's the way that in the way of intrinsic over extrinsic over systemic, and then this idea of knowing how clear you're thinking in those areas and that you can grow in each area, particularly the intrinsic. Is that the way you think it changes the world? Is that the reason you think it does?
Well, that is one factor in changing the world. Unfortunately, there are many other factors and elements in human life and human history that are at work. This is one factor that could help, but again, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, how it's going to transpire. And,
Right.
I wasn't aware because I'm so immersed in using the assessment and teaching, human resource leaders around the country, the axiology science. And, so I wasn't aware of until I got involved in the Institute in the past 2 years, how much more there is to Hartman's work.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot there in the archives. And so it'll be interesting to see if we can get that stuff published and out there, and so that people can then take that and build upon that.
Cliff Hurst is doing a great job in finding new stuff in the Hartman archives and getting it published. And there are some people who are still working very, very hard on the academic, theoretical side of Hartman's work. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who are working very, very hard on improving the Hartman value profile and how to interpret it correctly and how to use it in practical ways,
Yeah.
particularly in professional consulting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've had a big impact. A couple of I will have the whole quotes in the show notes, but Eddie Corbel, who is, he calls himself a newbie intellectual. I don't know if he uses those words, but, kind of new. And he just said basically that your explanation of axiology in one of the very first volume of the Journal of Formal Axiology, which I'll put a link to the pages on our institute to that journal. He says that your explanation of axiology is where it all began for me and has grown since into something I am convicted about and confident will be my life's work.
Well, that was just a 2-page article on what is formal axiology. I have posted many of my publications on various sites where you can read previously published stuff.
Yep.
That particular one has had thousands of readers, more than anything else I think I've ever published.
Yeah.
It's only 2 pages long.
It was
I hope it made a difference to somebody.
Yeah. Well, you just heard there. I am convicted and confident that this will be my life's work. And then he says, Rem has also paved the way for me to think critically and to constructively challenge some of the taken for granted concepts within formal axiology.
Well, I wrote a rather detailed book titled The Essentials of Formal Axiology. And that's the best and most detailed explanation of all of this that I have to offer to anyone. So if you really want to get into it, the theory of it underlying the profile, I recommend that book, The Essentials of Formal Axiology. And if you go to the bookstore page on our Hartman Institute website, you can find that book along with a lot of other good stuff.
Yes. I'm going to put a link specifically to that book in the show notes. So
Okay.
Philosophers or just people like me, consultants, not just, but us who aren't maybe as deep into it, can learn by looking at those articles and particularly the book, Essentials of Formal Axiology. You keep mentioning Cliff Hurst, and I'll put a link to his website just so if people are interested. He is the vice president of research at the Hartman Institute, and he's the writer of the new book, Revolution Against War. Have you had a chance to look at that and read that yet?
I have not had a chance, but I know pretty well. I mean, that's a collection of Hartman's writings. So I'm familiar with the writings independently, but not collected all together in that book. So I know what's in there pretty well. And I think Cliff has done a marvelous job of editing all of that and putting it all together into a book for people to see what Hartman had to say about this terrible problem of human war.
Yeah. How would you explain it to somebody, even though you haven't read the book, but you know his writings? How would you summarize that book to somebody, or what's in there?
Oh dear, I hardly know where to start on that one.
Just a couple of sentences, like, so if somebody says revolution against war, is that, am I going to be down about it? Is a protesting type book, or is it a hopeful book, or
Well, it is a hopeful book, but it analyzes the basic values that are involved in war and that are being violated by war. And probably the most significant of all, I mean, war is terribly destructive in every dimension of human value. It destroys, people burn books in order to promote wars. People destroy property with bombs and God only knows what else during war. People destroy people, and the psychology of destroying people in war is something that Hartman gave a great deal of thought to, and he realized that in order to destroy, to kill another person in a war, that you have no bones to pick with. I mean, the people the individuals that you kill in a war, you don't have a thing in the world against individually. They're just in the service of some political system. They're just pawns in a political system that have no real significance in and of themselves. And that's a terrible thing. That's the worst thing, the worst feature of all about war, is that in order to make a go of it, you have to disregard the significance and the value of individual human beings.
Yeah.
And human beings, the language of war, body bags instead of individual people, for example.
Yes.
All the language of war is designed to disguise the presence of valuable individual human beings that are being destroyed in those terrible conflicts that we're still involved with today, and I don't know that we'll ever get out of it.
Yeah.
But Hartman had a lot of good things to say about this, very illuminating things to say about this.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that I haven't read it yet, but that it's such a hopeful book. That was something that Catherine Blakemore, who was one of the helped with the design of it, said it's actually a hopeful book, which is interesting, because you think it really like, okay, this is going to be heavy, but not.
Well, it's readable.
Yeah.
And very illuminating.
Yes.
It tells you some things about war that you've never thought of before if you read it.
And to earlier, when you were talking about intrinsic over extrinsic over systemic, war would be the systemic is the biggest focus over extrinsic over intrinsic.
Yeah, it's basically systems rather than people. The way it's conceptualized is that it's just one system against another.
Yeah.
And it places systemic values like sovereignty, for example, over the value of all the property that gets destroyed and all the people who get destroyed in a war.
Wow, interesting. Well, we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Got the world upside down. I'll just put it that way.
Yes, it is upside down. Yes. We'll put a link to that book in the show notes. So let's talk a little bit more about you and your career. Who would you say has most influenced you? You talked about your mom and your grandmother. You talked about professors. Is there anybody who stands out over and above that?
Well, yeah, I want to mention two people. One of those is a philosopher who was teaching at Emory while I was there, both as an undergraduate and later as a graduate student, named Charles Hartman. Charles Hartman was one of the two founding fathers of a philosophical movement or development called process philosophy, and spilled over into theology, process theology as well. Hartshorn came to teach at Emory when I was a graduating senior at Emory. And that was how I really got into process thinking. Um, Explaining what that is can get complicated. I'm just going to say a few brief words about what that is. But Whitehead said that his philosophy was a philosophy that takes time seriously. And that's basically what process thinkers do. They take time seriously. Many philosophers, most philosophers maybe, have emphasized the spatial features of reality and neglected the temporality of it. Process thinkers believe that the most fundamental feature of reality, most fundamental general feature of reality as we know it is time. And they ask about the temporal aspects of everything you want to consider, including God. God has been traditionally relegated to changeless, static timelessness. Process philosophers have a new way of thinking about God. God is very real and involved with us in time, right here and now, in real time, and not just from the perspective of a changeless eternity. And that's a revolution in the way of thinking about God and theology. But you get the same sort of revolution when you start thinking about anything in process terms. And let me say one more thing, that I got acquainted with John Davis when we were both students at Emory. John Davis got his PhD in philosophy from Emory University. And during the year that Hartman came to teach at Emory, which was 1955-56, John and I were both students at Emory University in the philosophy department at that time. And I did not get to know John very well for the first, we were on the quarter system. I did not get to know John very well for the first 2 quarters. He was just another, graduate student hanging around. But in the 3rd quarter of my junior year, I got special permission to take a graduate course that was being taught by Charles Hartshorn. And John Davis was in that course.
Oh, how about that? There's that connection. John Davis.
That's how John Davis and I got acquainted with one another and came to respect one another. I didn't hear anything about or from John Davis for another 10 years. And he didn't hear anything from me. I don't know whether he did or not. But anyway, 10 years later, that course, when we all went our separate ways, and he went to teach at the University of Tennessee, he called me up. I was teaching at Jacksonville University in Florida at the time. He called me up and I wanted to know if I wanted to apply for a position in philosophy that was open at the University of Tennessee. And he talked me into taking it, and the rest is history.
How about that? And
but to continue with one other thing, process philosophy is one thing that has greatly influenced my thinking about everything. Robert S. Hartman is the other one.
Yeah.
And I've already said a lot about that, but during Hartman's first year here, which was 1968-69, he taught a graduate course in the English translation of The Structure of Value, which is his fundamental seminal work in axiology. That book had been published in Spanish earlier, but the English translation of it came out in 67 and 68-69. He taught a course in that course. I had enough good sense as a young philosopher at that time to realize that I could learn something from this guy. and got his permission to sit in on that course and several others later on as he was teaching with us. But that's what introduced me to axiology. It also introduced many of the graduate students who became the founding fundamental members of the Hartman Institute, some of which are still with us today and have persisted over the decades as members of the Hartman Institute. And we're all now members of what's called the Wisdom Council. A lot of old fuddy-duddy axiologists.
I don't see any fuddy-duddy. I see lots of liveliness and people in love with life. I love that description of process philosophy. I've never heard of that before, and I love
Well,
it.
I tried to get those two aspects of my own philosophical thinking together, trying to figure out how to relate them to one another. And I finally published a book on that titled An Axiological Process Ethics. And that came out in 2014. And what I try to show in there is that if you take the two together, they will compensate for the deficiencies that are in one another. And I think you get a much more complete and workable worldview if you combine those two dominant philosophical interest and influences of mine into one package, which I try to do in that particular book.
That's wonderful. That makes sense. That really clarifies a lot for me in regard to your thinking and your influences, and then what you're meaning when you say that Hartman's work is missing something.
Yeah.
So that's good. So we'll put a link to that book in the show notes as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So here's the next question. When you think of the word successful, who's the first person that comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is trying to figure out what it means to be successful.
Right. That's the tricky question.
And I guess that means achieving some objective. And of course, there can be private successes.
Yes.
In some sense of the term. But what we usually mean by successful is someone who's achieved some objective that receives some sort of social recognition or social commendation or respect.
You can make your own what you see as successful, and it could be that, or maybe it's something else.
Well, as an axiologist, I would have to analyze success in 3 dimensions.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm thinking.
And the people who are systemically successful are scientists and college teachers and philosophers and thinkers, people whose lives are dominated by the systemic values. Now, of course, no such people are purely systemic because everybody has the whole range of values to one degree or another. But systemic values dominate academics and other, professional thinkers. And you can be successful in, as an academic or as a thinker or writer or publisher or systemic valuer. You can also be extrinsically successful. Businessmen, I guess, are paradigm examples of people who are extrinsically successful. These are people who know how to actually get things done in the world. And you can be successful in that way too. Again, no one is purely extrinsic. And then you can be successful systemically. And what do you call those people? I mean, intrinsically. What do you call those people who are professionally successful intrinsically? Well, Hartman said that saintliness is a profession, just like any other profession, and it involves being it involves identifying yourself intensely with other people. Now, and we could identify many saintly people if we gave it a lot of thought. And these are people who are recognized as being loving and compassionate people who have other values and talents too. I mean, they express their love and compassion in the real world, and it's all guided by some sort of a belief system or conceptual framework. So now you can be successful in one such dimension primarily, and two, or in all three all at once. So to get back to your original question, who comes to mind? I try to think of somebody who's successful in all three dimensions, and the person who comes to mind to me is John Wesley, who founded the Methodist Church. I came very late in my life to the study of John Wesley, but when I discovered John Wesley, which was in 2009, I never read any of John Wesley before that. Since then, I've published 2 books on John Wesley.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to look up the titles of the books. We'll put
Yeah.
links to them in the show notes.
But
The 2 books. That's interesting that you discovered him just, 11
late
years
in
ago.
life, very late in life. Right? And
Yeah.
I think I was attracted to John Wesley in for 2 reasons. One is I've been a Methodist all my life, but nobody that I've been exposed to in Methodism ever told me much about John Wesley, and especially they never told me very much about John Wesley's ideas, what John Wesley thought, and that's, of course, is what has interested me as a philosopher. But when I started exploring what John Wesley thought, amazingly enough, I found him to be an almost perfect instantiation of Hartman's value theory.
Wow.
Religion.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. So people who don't know who John Wesley is, would you
Okay. John Wesley lived in the 18th century. He was well, I'll just say a great successful revivalist and a participant, the dominant participant, I think, in what is called the Great Awakening revivalism that swept England and this country in the 18th century. And as a result of all of that, he founded one great church, Protestant church, unintentionally, which he never really intended to do, but he founded the Methodist Church. And it's one of the largest Protestant churches available anywhere today. Now, I can say a great deal more about him, but I'm really more interested in his thoughts and his ideas than I am in his life or history. I'll put it in those terms. Let me give you just one example of how I think Wesley's thinking exemplifies formal axiology.
Awesome. That's perfect. I was just thinking.
One of his favorite verses, and this wasn't even a whole verse. This is one of his favorite phrases from the Bible. Came from the book of Galatians, 5th chapter in the New Testament, and it was the phrase, "the faith that works through love." Now, Wesley quoted that and explained that in sermon after sermon, writing after writing. It sort of summarized the gist of real Christianity and what he called true religion. And anybody who looks at that axiologically is going to see the 3 dimensions of value right there. The faith, if you understand that as, believing a lot of stuff,
Yep.
That's there. But the believing of stuff of a lot of stuff has to be combined with doing it, living it. If you don't live it, if you don't practice it, if you don't practice what you preach, you don't really believe it. So these 3 dimensions of value are all there and they're so intertwined, you cannot really separate them from one another. And when you try to do it, you get into trouble. And of course, you have to believe stuff, live it, and do it out of love and compassion and intrinsic valuation. And I've written 2 books trying to explain all that to people, but that's and the hierarchy of values even there in Wesley's works as well. There are several passages in which he ranks what he calls the basic elements of Christianity, and at the top of that ranking is love. Everything he said in the scriptures and in Christianity and all of its manifestations must be related to love as the sum of all. And religion, true religion, was for him primarily a matter of the heart and not of the head, but the head was there and the body was there, the faith, the works, and the love all have to be there. And you judge everything else and its true significance by the dominant thing. The first thing of all is love. Love to God, love to your fellow human beings, love to your neighbor as yourself. And Wesley, interestingly, said quite explicitly, there's some unloving things in the scriptures. And we can't believe those things simply because they're in the scriptures. Everything in the scriptures has to be evaluated, he said, in terms of its nearness to or distance from love. So you got the hierarchy of value with the intrinsic as the dominant value, the dominant ideal in what he called true religion. And you've got the 3 dimensions of value. They're all there in John Wesley. And you just have to dig it out and publish it.
Yes. So we're going to put your links to your books. And the thing is with axiology, once you know it, it's everywhere. It's in everything. It's so interesting. And I love the connection there. I mean, you see examples of it everywhere. It's like gravity. It just is. And it's just so nice
to be applies to everything. It will help you understand everything. It will help you understand people. It will help you understand politics. It'll help you understand religion. It'll help you understand anything and everything you're dealing with in life. It's just a tremendously valuable tool, or what Hartman called frame of reference.
Yes. And it's interesting how divine that insight is when you can go. When was Wesley around? What did you say? The
1800s.
1800s. Hartman's around in the 1960s. Or, he's longer than that, but, it's just interesting how the divine ties together in.
Well, of course, Wesley didn't know anything about Hartman, but it's all there. I mean, all the dimensions of value are right there in Wesley's thinking. The hierarchy of value is right there in Wesley's thinking.
Yes.
And you can just bring that frame of reference to your reading of John Wesley, and you can see Hartman
everywhere. Well, and it's, it's just basically that there's universal truths. I always feel like those are universal truths. So, Wesley said it, and then Hartman kind of tapped into it as he did his research, and based on his background, he was the perfect person to bring that forward. And then based on your background and your experiences, you're the perfect person to have brought forward what you brought forward. It all has to me, the spark of divine in it, the universal truth.
Well, we're all working together, and we hope we can get somewhere with it.
Yep, I think we are. Now, as I'm talking to you, I'm seeing someone, we had exchanged emails, but prior to the conference, I had never met you in person. So I've met you in person via Zoom. Thank goodness for Zoom. But what I see is someone very vibrant, very active. And you even said you have, I think the words you use are, you're still active professionally. And of course you are. And you have impacted so many people. and you are so lively. So what I would like to ask is around a Wake Up Eager. You have said before, I know I'm retired, but I'm busier than ever. My days
Yeah,
go by so fast. And I don't know if you want to share your age or not, but what
mine.
was
I'm,
that?
I'm, I'm 86 years old,
86 years young.
and my wife and I have been married for 58 years.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So talk a little bit about, a lot of what we talk about in the work that I do. This is the Wake Up Eager Workforce podcast. And so a lot of the tools and things are about, how can we create work and life that is meaningful, that we wake up eager. And that's like a personal value for me, that you're in the right place doing the right things, and you have those aha moments like you did with the professor, and then you follow those dreams
Yeah.
and give so much good to the world. And it's kept you very vibrant and alive. So I am curious about things that you would share around waking up eager, systemic, extrinsic, intrinsic. So what are some things that you do, mind, body, and spirit, that have that you can pass on to us or share?
Uh, well, mind, body, and spirit, that covers a lot of territory. Obviously, I read a lot and study a lot and think a lot and write a lot and edit other people's work a lot and do what I can to publish. And I'm still doing that. I
Yeah.
still, my curiosity has not diminished with age,
Yep.
and I'm still trying to figure things out and find some people who can help me, like Hartshorn and Hartman, along the way. Physically, I have been graced, I suppose, with a significant degree of health at my age. Uh, I'm physically active. I do a lot of yard work and gardening, and right now I'm engaged in leaf raking and grinding up leaves and putting them in my compost pile. In the spring and summer, I have a fairly large vegetable garden, and I work very hard in that, and luckily I'm still able to do that kind of physical work. Uh, One of my hobbies is growing cactuses outside.
Really?
Yeah, I have one of the largest outdoor cactus gardens in East Tennessee.
You're
It's a
kidding.
big it's a big job to do it because you have to keep them covered all winter long with clear plastic, and you have to cover them up every time you're having too much rain. They can take cold weather, but they can't take a lot of rain. So it's a real chore, but it's a lot of fun because cactuses have incredibly beautiful blooms. So that's one of my bad habits.
Yeah, that's unusual.
uh,
Cactus. Yeah, the largest in East
And
Tennessee.
of course,
That's
my
amazing.
wife and I walk a good bit together, so I am physically active. Uh, Socially, uh, social life has been cut down significantly
Yes, COVID is kind of
during this
did that.
corona, this COVID-19 crisis. Uh, but my wife and I are happily married and have been so for 58 years, and she has sustained me in so many ways through the years, and I hope that I have also sustained her. We have two children and four grandchildren. We're all very close. These days, we Zoom with one another a lot,
Oh, that's great.
even though we cannot get together face to face. And we're going to miss Thanksgiving and Christmas together this year,
Oh,
but we will still be Zooming with one another and enjoying one another that way. I suppose that while I was working at the University of Tennessee, the people in the philosophy department were my broader social world. Uh, and I had a lot of very good, close friends there, and had a chance to practice and apply my intrinsic values as well as my extrinsic and systemic values there. Since I retired, I suppose my most important outside the family social contact has been with Church Street United Methodist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. We've been a member of that church since 1974. I've taught in recent years. I've been teaching John Wesley.
Oh, wonderful.
Two adult classes in that church, and of course now we're only doing church services online,
Mhm.
as there are most churches these days. But
Mhm.
those kinds of social contacts are still very much a part of my life. So I try to cover all three dimensions in my
Yes,
list.
you did. And it's a testimony to staying curious, staying interested. What I have noticed in my family is with the elderly folks, that are in their 80s, their world has gotten smaller,
Yeah,
not bigger. Um,
that can happen. I
and
hope I'm not intellectually brain dead yet.
no,
But you have to work at it in
you have to
order
work at it, and so,
to
yeah.
you when you get to be my age.
Yeah, well, it's a testament to having interests continually to be curious, making connections with people. That's the thing too that I mentioned in your comments. I already said it, but that intrinsic dimension, you connected with people not because of just your knowledge, but because your willingness to be with them. When
Well,
you,
I hope I can help them in one way or another. Another thing that I do, I carry on an extensive email correspondence with a lot of people about a lot of things, and I'm hoping that maybe some things that I say to people in email correspondence will be meaningful and helpful to them.
yeah, you haven't let the world pass you by. You know what I mean? You're up to speed. You're on Zoom, you're doing email. I mean, all of those things is something everybody can do, but unfortunately, not everyone can do, but most of the world can do these things as we pass through time. But you've specifically done it, and it's awesome. It's a role model for me for sure.
Thank
In
you.
a lot of ways,
Appreciate that.
yes, in a lot of ways, it's beautiful. Um, so speaking of that, passing through time and then doing a little time travel, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Ah, I would say keep going. You're on the right track. The best is yet to come. To
Uh,
my 86-year-old self, I would say keep going. You're on the right track, but the
yeah,
best is now behind you.
yeah, that's awesome. There you go. There's the wake up eager philosophy. Keep staying interested. Don't get stuck. So that's beautiful. So last couple of questions. If you could have a billboard anywhere, so you can put a billboard up anywhere in the country, where would you put it and what would it say?
Oh dear. Well, I would like to have a billboard scattered on the interstates saying, think hard, live hard, and love hard.
Ah, I love that. All the dimensions are in there, of course. Think, live, and love. Yes. And then we're going to close. People that are listening are people out in the workforce, probably some philosophers as well, people out there leading teams and organizations, um, and perhaps leading in the colleges as teachers and professors and in the schools. So what's one last bit of wisdom or advice you'd like everybody to take away as we've talked about Hartman's work specifically, because this is a Hartman Influencers series, but we've also talked about life and other people who've impacted you. What would you say is a takeaway? And you can share more than one if you want.
Well,
What do you want
I'm
them to
going to give you
remember?
one brief answer to that, and that is know thyself and use Hartman. Both the Hartman value profile and a knowledge of Hartmanian axiology to become better acquainted with yourself. And once you've done that, it'll transform your whole life
Mm,
and it'll transform it for the better.
that's wonderful. Speaking of that, do you remember when you first took, I know I said that was the last question, but it sparked another one. Do you remember when you first took the Hartman Value Profile?
Yeah, I took it while Hartman was here teaching with us at the University of Tennessee, and he interpreted my profile for me in person. And taking that profile, you know, I said I had some disagreements with Hartman here and there along the way, almost from the very beginning. But taking that profile and having it interpreted for me was the very first thing that convinced me that Hartman was really on the right track of something.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was something that I needed to study further, learn more about, and try to give a fair chance and a fair hearing to what he had to say. I don't remember much of the details of what he told me. I do remember that on the whole, he really nailed me to the wall. You know, he knew exactly who I was. In no uncertain terms. And I think I've said before in earlier discussions, I think that he was wrong about one thing about me. He actually told me when he was interpreting my profile that I should never make any practical decisions about anything. Well, I really think that was a bit of an exaggeration. You know, the extrinsic dimension is probably the weakest of my dimensions, and that did show up, as a matter of fact, on my Hartman value profile. But I do think that I'm not totally incompetent extrinsically.
Oh, no. And the whole deal is we can grow those areas with knowledge. So if it
Very
was
true.
lower at that point, it was because you were in college being a philosophy student, really in the realm of ideas, but you are so much ado. I mean, your emails are, yeah. So I would say that's not true today, but that's, you know, probably because maybe you got some insight and you consciously built that. I don't know. You know.
But anyway, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you and have this interview with you, and I greatly appreciate your being the new president of the Hartman Institute. I think you're going to take us somewhere. Under your leadership, we can go forward. Definitely.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It's an honor. And it's I've been on other volunteer situations and boards and things, but this is the only one that has really touched my heart. And like, I really want to do it. I'm not, you know, it's just, it feels like, I don't know, on purpose.
Well, I would say to you, keep going. You're on the right track. And the
Yes.
best is yet to come.
And it's wonderful knowing people like you and your value
It's good
for
to know
all that
people
you have
like
done.
you too, and so many other wonderful people who are now in the Hartman Institute and have been in the Hartman Institute in the past.
Yeah, such interesting, caring, good people. It's just a wonderful thing to be associated with. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you indeed.